Professor Lisa Alexander. I teach courses in housing and community development at the law school, and I'm a housing law scholar. And I'm thrilled to be able to moderate our panel today. We have with us Matthew Desmond, who is the John Lowell Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, a former member of the Harvard Society of Fellows, and he's also a former sociology PhD here at the University of Wisconsin. Based on the work that he did in Milwaukee for so many years, he's also a MacArthur Genius Scholar and the author of a new book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. And we're so fortunate to have him here today on sort of the opening of his book. We also have here William Tisdale, who is CEO of the Milwaukee Fair Housing Council. He has been involved with civil rights and fair housing for years, and is really an authority on issues of fair housing, particularly here in Wisconsin.
America is unmatched for the depth and extent of its poverty compared to all other developed democracy. And I wanted to try to get my head around this by understanding how housing is central to the lives of low-income families today. We knew a lot about jobs and joblessness. We have books on welfare reform. We know the role mass incarceration is playing in exacerbating inequality in our cities today. But housing, especially the private housing market, has largely been overlooked by politicians, journalists, and social scientists alike. I think most Americans think the typical low-income family lives in public housing or benefits in some way from housing assistance. The opposite is true. Only about 1 in 4 households that qualify for any kind of housing assistance receive it. Think about that. Like, what if we did food stamps like that? What if we turned away 3 in 4 folks that applied for food stamps hungry? But that's exactly how we treat housing assistance today. In some of our largest cities like Washington, D.C., the waiting list for public housing is not counted in years, it's counted in decades, which means a young parent who applies for public housing literally could be a grandparent by the time his or her application is reviewed. And I know these things not only from looking at the statistics and designing surveys and analyzing hundreds of thousands of eviction records, but also by spending time with families whose lives have been affected by eviction. And so I met a woman named Lorraine in Milwaukee. She was a grandmother. She lived in a trailer park on the far south side of the city. She received disability for a childhood accident that left her incapable of working. And she spent over 70% of her disability check to rent a trailer in a trailer park that the city of Milwaukee at that time literally classified as an environmental biohazard. That left Lorraine with some really tough decisions. Should I pay for medication or should I pay the rent? Should I pay to get my gas bill paid on or should I pay the rent? And one day she did. She paid the gas bill because she wanted to take a hot shower, and that left her evicted. And people like Lorraine that are paying over 70% of their income on housing are regrettably not rare in this country. We've reached a point today where the majority of poor renting families are spending at least half of their income on rent and utilities, and 1 in 4 are spending over 70% of their income on housing. Under those conditions, eviction has become commonplace. Eviction, this thing that used to be rare and scandalous and used to draw crowds, is something that we've grown quite used to in poor neighborhoods. In Milwaukee, if you look just in court records, you see that in an average year, 40 people are evicted every day in the city of Milwaukee. That happens all year round, including on days like yesterday, which was freezing and snowing in that city. Eviction causes loss. We know that eviction causes families to move into worse neighborhoods, to move into substandard housing. Part of the reason is because eviction comes with a record. Just like a criminal record, it can have real effects on your life. Many landlords refuse to rent to folks with recent evictions on their record. Public housing authorities count evictions as strikes against your application, which means that arguably the people that are most in need of this assistance, the evicted, are systematically denied it. We have really good evidence that eviction causes job loss, and if anyone in this room has ever experienced an involuntary displacement from your house, you know exactly why that is. It's a consuming, stressful, overwhelming event that can cause you to make mistakes on your job. And we also know that eviction takes a toll on your spirit. So we have evidence that moms who were evicted 2 years later have higher rates of depression. You add all that up, and it's hard not to conclude that eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty today. It's making things worse. And we can't fix poverty without fixing housing. If any of you have spent time in housing court, you know exactly what the face of the eviction epidemic looks like. And it looks like a bunch of kids, and it looks like a lot of moms. Most households in Milwaukee that are evicted have kids living with them. And eviction is something that affects the old and the young, the able-bodied, and sick, but it has a disproportionate effect on low-income communities of color, and especially moms and women within those communities. In Milwaukee, 1 in 5 Black women renters report having been evicted sometime in her life. So the way I've come to think about that is that if in low-income African-American communities, Black men are locked up, swept up by the long reach of the criminal justice system, and they are disproportionately bearing the cost and the brunt, the ramifications of the affordable housing crisis. So what should we do about it? I think before we answer that question, we as a society need to answer another one, which is, do we really believe that housing is a right? And I know it sounds like a rote question, but it's central to this. We've affirmed the right to basic education, security in old age, adequate nutrition, because we believe that those things are fundamental to human flourishing. It's hard to argue that stable, affordable shelter is not. I think housing has to be considered a right, and the reason is simple. Without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. And that means that if we want to deliver on this right, we need a program that's big enough to match the scale of the problem. It's not just let's build a little bit more public housing, or it's not just let's invest in the National Housing Trust. We need something universal. And so I think the best way to do that is take this program that we already have, housing vouchers, and expand it to everyone below a certain income level. That means that, very simply, instead of someone like Lorraine paying 70% of her income on housing, she would pay 30%. She could take that voucher and live wherever she wanted, as long as her housing wasn't too expensive or too shoddy. It would massively change the face of poverty in America. We know from research that after years on the waiting list, one big thing that people do after they receive a housing voucher, you know where they take their extra money? To the grocery store. They buy more food. Their kids become stronger and less anemic. But kids that are living in families that are being crushed by the high cost of housing aren't so lucky, and they're not getting enough to eat because the rent eats first. So that's like one suggestion. You know, what works in Milwaukee or Madison might not work in Houston or Dallas or New York. Let's put it on the table. Whatever our solution is, housing has to be part of it. And whatever our way out of this mess, this like co-denial of basic needs, this vast inequality, this blunting of human capacity, there's no value in America that justifies this. There's no piece of scripture or holy teaching or ethical principle that can be summoned to defend what we've allowed our country to become.
Thank you so much.
I am Bill Tisdale. I'm the president and CEO of the Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council. The Fair Housing Council is a private nonprofit organization. Our office in Milwaukee is our main office. We cover Milwaukee, Milwaukee, Washington, and Waukesha counties in that area. We have an office here in Madison on Maine, which covers Dane County. We also do some work in Rock County. And we also have an office in Appleton, which covers Brown, Calumet, Winnebago, Outagamie, and counties and the city of Fond du Lac. Our organization is specifically designed to enforce federal, state, and local fair housing laws. And so we cover all areas of housing, sales, rental, insurance, and mortgage lending. So if housing discrimination is occurring or individuals feel they have been victims of housing discrimination in those areas, we cover it. So I've seen all sides of housing discrimination, from the overt to the subtle. One of the things I think people don't realize is that housing discrimination isn't just getting turned down for rent, or to rent a place, or to buy a place. Significant impacts occur in some of the areas that are supposedly set up to help individuals. Most of you, if not all of you, have heard about the assistance programs, housing choice vouchers, and low-income housing tax credits. All of these programs, or both of these programs, have been designed to assist individuals in expanding housing choice. Matt's books and Matt's studies talk a lot about poverty, the concentration of poverty, and how that impacts people's daily lives. Our mantra is, where people live determine everything. Where you live determine where you work, where you go to school, who your associations with, your access to employment, your access to healthcare delivery systems. All of those are dependent and interdependent on housing. They're inextricably linked. There's no way to work on one without the other. So, I'm going to start by saying the overlay of race and income in Milwaukee, every place else as well, is such that when you talk about the actions that disproportionately affect low-income individuals, we can unfortunately substitute that with African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Hmong, and other populations. Opportunities for low-income families renting a home in suburban municipalities is slim. In addition to barriers, NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is NIMBY. The two primary vehicles for creating affordable housing are still perpetuating segregation. Those are low-income housing tax credits and housing choice voucher programs. Those are manipulated by the system, and in fact, instead of doing what they were designed to do, in many cases obstruct, impair, and impede individuals from accessing and expanding their housing choices. LIHTC, which is low-income housing tax credits, basically that's distributed to low-income housing developers through an application process, and then the distribution is administered through state housing agencies or authorities. Housing choice voucher programs. So everybody knows what housing choice vouchers are. You get vouchers for low-income individuals can receive vouchers, and they are used to obtain housing, and then the landlord agrees that he or she will accept the voucher. It's a voluntary program, which is a problem. And he or she accepts the applicant being on the rent assistance program, it used to be called Section 8. And then part of that rent is provided by the voucher. I'd like to talk about the obstacles to these, which I mentioned earlier. Exclusionary zoning practices are definitely obstacles to this. Those local communities create barriers, both institutional and individual, to building affordable housing in high opportunity communities. High opportunity communities are those that have access to employment, health, transportation, schools, and thereby increasing and expanding quality of life and increasing the likelihood of greater socioeconomic parity. Exclusionary zoning practice, things such as minimum lot size, green space, density limits, all of these preclude building multifamily units. And then when developers are in the market and can do multifamily units, many times limited to 2-bedroom units, disproportionately affecting minority populations, particularly African American, Hmong, and Latinos, usually need more than 2 bedrooms for their families. And so they, by definition, this is the housing that's available, this is where it's available, they're locked out and excluded from participating in that expanded housing choice. There used to be, many years ago, programs called model cities, and there are other programs that designated where affordable housing would be made available. The interesting thing about that is that when governments decide to participate in these programs, they decide where the properties are also to be built. And so when you have high densities of minority populations, poverty populations, low-income populations, those were designated to some of the least desirable areas of the community, if not outside the community. And when protests come to the people who are elected officials, they generally cave as to where those housing opportunities are made available. So you have situations where you have these programs available, but opposition to those, public opposition to those, kind of sway the determinations of where those properties go. Politicians decide, let's put it in this neighborhood, NIMBYism takes place. It's nice to have stuff that doesn't provide environmental racism as far as dumping grounds and things of that nature, but everybody agrees with that. They're definitely sure they don't want those kinds of things, and those kinds of things should be addressed. But not in my backyard. So where do these folks go? Generally relegated to areas of their communities or towns that are dilapidated, poor services, poor streets, poor representation. All of you, I'm sure, know all politicians aren't made equal, so some get more press than others, some get more things done than others. And the people who are most dependent on these individuals to provide assistance and direction and guidance for them are the folks that get the least help. And some of these programs, by design, retroactively and contemporarily, deny these people access to the housing rights that everybody deserves, and it is a right. And as Matt said in his book, this should be on the top agenda for all individuals, for everybody, for every government, for every system of government, from federal, state, local, down to the hamlets. Every place should have this as a top priority, but it's not. There's no political will to deal with housing. And individuals, as I said before, these are inextricably linked, so everybody deals with everything piecemeal. We talk about transportation. Oh, job growth will be the job in employment. That's going to be the answer. That's going to be the key. And the systems that are designed, at least in the metropolitan Milwaukee area, are designed to get suburbanites to Milwaukee, but not workers to the suburban jobs. So where you have the highest job growth, Waukesha has some of the highest job growth in the country, and they're demanding, oh, we need workers. The folks can't get out there. The bus lines aren't designed that way. They stop running at 11 o'clock, so what do you do when you're working the third shift? Sundown regulations or ordinances many years ago kept people even from going from one side of town to the other, let alone from one community to the other. So I'm going to wrap up. I have 6 more pages of stuff to talk about.
We'll talk about questions too. Yeah.
But I'm going to wrap up now, but just trying to give you an overview of the kinds of things that we deal with on a regular basis. It's discrimination. And I didn't even get into talking about discrimination. No kids. No service animals. They call service animals pets. So these are the kinds of things that people who have disabilities need to make their lives usable for them. And until we can start dealing with these issues and have the political will to talk about them, and then put money to address them, and then have programs that are run economically efficiently enough to carry them out as they were designed to be carried out. Matt and I will be here next year. Matt will be here 10 years from now. I'll be retired. But we'll still be talking about these kinds of problems.
Thank you so much. Well, I want to take a second to introduce our third panelist, M. Adams, who has been involved in many forms of activism and is a founder and co-executive director of Freedom Inc. But prior to that, she was involved with a movement and a group called Take Back the Land, and particularly headed up the Take Back the Land Madison branch, which is part of her connection to housing. And that organization, I know from my own work, has talked a lot about the right to housing. So maybe we can continue this conversation of what it means to have a right to housing, why we don't, and why we might need it.
For me, it's not at all difficult to see the connections between them. And it's not at all, I don't, in that sense or in that vein, I do not feel like there's a competition as to which issue or which sector to fight in front of. And in fact, I think they're all very deeply interconnected. And I think the root causes of one are often the root causes of another. So 5, 6, 7 years ago, we were in a moment, much like we have a moment now, where a particular instance happened, particular groups of people were affected, and particular people took action in different ways. So here, more recently, you have people who have taken it to the streets to protest police violence, police murders. 6, 7 years ago, you had people who were engaged in a number of land occupations or a number of housing takeovers to protest the massive foreclosures of housing, the massive level of evictions, and different things like that. In both instances, but focusing on the housing, there was a crisis, or at least people talked about the issues as being a crisis. So what actually causes a crisis? A conflict, right? So we are talking about what's happening around housing as a housing crisis, but the truth is the wood isn't in crisis, the nails aren't in crisis, the hammer is not in crisis, the people's ability to strike a hammer is not in crisis, right? What's actually in crisis is our communities. Our human rights are actually what are in crisis. people's ability to live well, people's ability to have a life that where it's successful, where they have adequate housing or adequate resource to be able to make the most out of existing and participating in society. So that's how we understand the issue. So the question was posed, is housing is a human right? We assert that housing is in fact a human right. So when we think about what's actually happening around housing, we say that the Black community or communities in general are facing a human rights crisis as it relates to housing. The crisis is actually in our communities and not in some abstract thing in a stack of papers behind someone's desk. So the crisis is caused by a conflict in rights. So I assert, and we assert, that we have the human right to housing, and other people assert that people have the right to profit. Now, rights conflicts are not new concepts, right? So I believe I have the right to play the music as loud as I want to play it, and my mother believes she has the right to peace and quiet, right? Rights conflicts are not a new thing, but each society has to make a determination on how to solve the rights conflict or how to solve the rights issues. By and large, we live in a society with the economic system of capitalism, and we don't have to discuss capitalism if people don't want, but in what is called a market economy, where the rights of profit have been foremost and have been centered in how the society operates and how the society runs. And it's pretty clear to me that the rights of people to continue to have profit and to grow and increase profits is growing mutually exclusive from the rights of people to have adequate housing. We see more and more where the rights of corporations or particular government entities or a particular sector of owning class society has the right to continue to act out, to continue to control laws, policy, culture, hegemony, to increase profit, where many others of us in the sectors of society are increasingly losing our rights to implement housing, right? So that's exactly what happened in, 6 years ago? Time is flying by, 6 years ago, right? There was a decision to be made. Do banks have the right to continue to increase profit by receiving federal bailout money and keeping the properties? Was the function of housing essentially the question to be a profit center for money, for corporations, for government? Or was the function of housing actually to shelter or to house people? And this society, right, not that we didn't go fighting and resist it, but by and large, the society, the structures of the government, the superstructures of the government have chosen and decided that the function of housing was to be a profit center for banks. So imagine Madison right now, I assume, gets its water from some local water source nearby. And imagine if tomorrow I was able to own all the land or all the surrounding areas of that water. And then I said, well, I'm going to jack up some water prices. I'm going to sell water to you at $5 a bottle. Except when it's the summer and everybody's running triathlons, marathons, and going to the gym, then I'm going to sell it to you at $10 a bottle. But don't worry, there is going to be government or public subsidized water for you. For those who cannot afford it, it won't be nearly as good of a quality as mine is, and they won't have as much to you available. But don't worry, it'll be there. That seems to be a bit strange, right? We would say, well, no, that's not right. And you don't have the right to go and own all of the water, right? You don't have the right to go and take all the water and sell it how you want to sell it, do it how you want to do it, and then just think we're going to sit here and go thirsty, right? We're going to starve, not starve to death, we're going to die of thirst, that's it. And we're going to die of thirst as a result, but that's exactly what we've done around land. And though those are seemingly two different issues, the sort of principles and values that we have in determining how each is structured are the same, right? I assert that water is a human right, and I also assert that housing is a human right. And so how do you elevate housing as a human right? Not just as a principle, not just as rhetoric, and not just as a value, but what does housing actually look like as a human right in structure? Our position is that if you are honestly going to have housing as a human right be implemented, then you have to move to the decommodification of land as an entity. So housing is the urban land question, right? But we could very well be having this conversation about black farmers in the rural South. We could be having this conversation around water rights access for indigenous tribes. We could be having this conversation around who can stand on a street corner and the use of public space and recreation, right? All of these are land questions, essentially. But housing continues to be, at least for my community, the major urban land question. And so we developed a movement called Take Back the Land. And the function of Take Back the Land was to elevate housing as a human right and to ultimately fight for the decommodification of land. We knew that you could not continue to use land as a profit center and also meet the real life human needs of what our communities and what people need just to survive. And so Take Back the Land developed in Miami, Florida, where a group of Black low-income folks got together and built a shanty town on land that was supposed to be used to develop public housing units. The shanty town was built to develop. They were able to do some amazing things. They were able to develop their own little urban garden. People were able to get political education. Folks were getting support around mental wellness and a whole list of other things and other issues that we think of when we think of housing, right? So not just a person being in a couple in some walls, but also the things that constitute a home and constitute a community were able to happen there. Eventually the government, folks organized, but eventually the government and its repression burned down the shanty town. Considering the energy of that, a decision was made to take that movement national. So this is pre-occupied groups, mainly Black or Black-led at least, groups around the country decided to engage in a similar campaign. So here in Madison, we developed a Take Back the Land Madison group, where we identified housing structures or housing buildings, or houses, apartments or houses that were where the landlords were people who received, the major corporations, major banks who received bailout monies to supply housing, but actually didn't, just evicted people. We identified those, and we did what we thought was the morally right thing to do. We paired homeless people with peopleless housing. And so we did what we call liberation. We moved people in. We were successfully able to liberate 4 properties, and we were able to house 6 Black queer women, most of whom had children, and we were able to sustain them housing for at least 6 months. And so that was the campaign. So steady thinking about, we used that direct action to continue to elevate the issues to also fight for what we thought to be just and equitable housing. So
great, thank you. I'm really excited to have a housing panel actually kind of turn into a discussion about the right to housing, because as everyone has said, in the United States we don't have a formal right to housing, and most of the time when you talk about housing law and policy, it seems odd and strange to talk about it in the terms of rights. But in some ways, what every panelist here has said is that the issues that they work on largely happen to be a function of the fact that that's not a right that individuals have that they can demand against the government, and what the implications of that are. I guess one of my questions is, you all mentioned a lot of the different housing programs that exist. Low-income housing tax credit, housing choice vouchers, project-based Section 8, blah, 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 blah. And in many ways, implicit in what you're saying is that the way that those programs are designed has not expressly dealt with the problem. But Matthew mentioned a solution, which is to have a national sort of voucher program that would be larger and broader than the voucher program we have now. And I was wondering your thoughts about that as a solution to some of the problems, or one solution, and other solutions that you all have thought about how we should be thinking about housing differently to open up housing access and housing equity, and make housing something that leads to other opportunities.
We have all the laws in place. The problem is compliance with those laws. So as far as not only affordable housing, but other types of housing, one of the things that we see most as an obstacle to resolving this problem is housing discrimination. There are a host of individuals who are kind of in the gaps. They don't own a home, they rent, they're not on a subsidy. Those individuals constantly face the issues of where they can move, where they can live, what kinds of access they have, quality of life kinds of things. And as long as we have restrictions which are institutional, both at the public level and at the individual level, we're going to continue to, as I said, debate these problems and have these problems. So I don't understand why we aren't doing these things after all of these years. I'd like to hear more about universal kinds of programs that would provide assistance to those in need. I think that that's a good thing. But once we have those in place, I don't know if they're going to work unless we also address the issues of discrimination.
The primary objective under capitalism for owning class folks, and maybe even not owning class people, but the primary objective is to increase profit. So the question then becomes, how do you convince people who are looking to increase profit to actually take less so that people can have housing? So you have an example like Detroit. The issue isn't that there aren't housing units. There are tens of thousands of vacant homes and thousands of homeless people. And there's no competition for those homes. It's not like, some 30,000 people are gonna fall out the sky and somehow offer more for those, right? But they're not renting to people because they're drawing off of insurance claims or receiving, right? So how do you convince landlords in that situation that, look, you have a group of people, many of which are unemployed due to the socio-political landscape of that area. You need to let people live here. How do you convince people of that under capitalism? I'm not entirely sure that you can. The other way you could do it is you could somehow create some sort of, for us, what would be a social movement that would destabilize or that would cause such pressure to the owning class where they would settle for some level of profit versus no profit because that's what the movement is pushing. And so I think ultimately, if you continue to have the competition of the rights of profit held by landlords, banks, governments, or whoever, versus the rights to be in a space under a market economy, the rights to be in a space, the right to housing, the right to stand on the corner, the right to lay down in the park, all of those rights continue to be secondary to the primal right of profit increasing. And so I'm not entirely sure that what the success of a universal program would be. We have people in this exact city who have Section 8 vouchers that can't rent anywhere. And so I think we have to solve the commodification and the privatization of housing fundamentally.
In 2013, the American Housing Survey asked, do you think you're going to be evicted soon? 2.8 million renters said, yeah, I do. Whatever our way out of this, it has to be, we have to think about scale. We have to think about how big the problem is. And I feel that what a universal housing voucher program does is take a program that we know increases people's neighborhood quality, stabilizes their lives, increases their children's well-being, taking that thing and expanding it, adjudicates between the landlord's need to make a living and the tenant's need to live. And I feel that, I feel that efforts to do things like to decommodify the land and stuff, that should be on the table. Let's do it. Let's have that conversation. But you guys work really, really hard, and you guys have like 4 people. You know what I mean? And it's like, we need to do something that has this unlucky vast majority of folks that are struggling. And I feel like we have to work within the confines that we have. We have to accept the fact that we as a country house the vast majority of our low-income families in the private market. And if that market isn't profitable, there can be a lot of collateral damage from that. And we're a long way away from talking about decommodification on a scale that we need. So I think we have a program that works. We also have a program that it's not perfect. You're right, it's not perfect. And like, we need to think about things like not only racial discrimination, but source of income discrimination. The fact that landlords can choose whether you accept a voucher or not.
Families with children.
Exactly. And I do think we can do things to bring landlords to the table. One thing that we can do is we can think about property code. And I think there's some codes that are absolutely essential to human flourishing and health, and there's some codes that aren't. And I think that a lot of landlords that I spend time with, the number one reason they didn't want to rent to voucher families is because they didn't want another inspector. They didn't want to deal with that. I think that can be on the table. And I think there's a way to offer landlords things like a steadier income, lower evictions, and a real conversation about property code in exchange for toothier source of income laws and maybe price controls too.
And Matt, how do we address the issues of just people don't want, the owners don't want certain kinds of folks in their units?
Yeah.
Families with children
Yeah.
come to mind as something that we face often as far as complaints that come up. We've had landlords during our investigations tell our investigators, our testers, I'll leave the place vacant before I rent to anybody else. And then there's the double standard where we have African Americans who are attempting to rent a unit. They're told by the landlord, there's a waiting list, there's nothing available right now, we'll get back to you. When our white tester comes, who follows that person during our investigation, who is equally qualified, everything's equal on every socioeconomic characteristic is the same age, marital status, debts, income, all of those things. When that white person comes, we've had so many instances where they said, God, it's sure good to see a black face. You know, 2 years ago, I had a black family in here. They tore the hell out of my place. They tore the screens down, they burned the carpet, they did this, they did that. And my question is always, has never a landlord had a white person do that? But they vowed never to rent to a black person because they had an experience with an African American or a Latino. And that now has set the standard by which they judge all others. And so the discrimination that's occurring, the units are available, programs are in place to take care of it, but we have these attitudes that formulate that behavior that we've got to get at. So there can be property available, there can be houses available, there can be programs available. We still must deal with the issue that folks would rather move out, move away, close down, before they will accept certain types of people who look different than them, because we always have folks telling us about different values. And I don't know what all that stuff means. I have different values than M. M has different values than Matt, than Lisa. All of us have different values, but how does a class of people become so crystallized that you can look at a person, see what they look like, and now determine what that person's going to do, who they are, what they're going, where they've been, what their family looks like, all of those things. And that's what housing has become at this point as far as availability.